Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for coming today. You're very welcome to the Dublin Festival of History. My name is Cormac Kinsella. The Dublin Festival of History is funded by Dublin City Council and is produced by Dublin City Libraries and the Dublin City Council Culture Company. Today we've got a very interesting panel. The Irish government launched the Decade of Centenaries in 2012 to celebrate and re-examine the major historical events during the foundation of the Irish state. At the end of the decade, this expert panel will discuss the changing nature of women's representation during the time. And on the panel this morning, we have Liz Gillis, we have Mary McAuliffe and Sinead McCoole. And chairing this, I'm delighted to say, a friend of long standing at the festival is Margaret Ward, who is an honorary senior lecturer of history at Queen's University in Belfast. Her many publications include Fearless Women, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, Feminism and the Irish Revolution, and her pioneering book, Unimaginable Revolutionaries, Women and the Irish Nationalism, was reissued in a revised and updated edition in 2021. The panel are going to just have a conversation for about 40 minutes, then there will be time for questions from all of you, so please have a question ready so we're not frantically waiting at the end, coughing and being nervous. But also I would ask, we have roving mics, and I'd be really grateful if you just wait until you have the mic in your hand before you ask your question. At the very end, after the hour is up, we're going to see a short film, a 10-minute film, about the work that the Manaw 100 team have been doing as part of the Decade of Commemorations. So you could please welcome now the panel and Margaret Ward. Thank you.
Welcome everyone on this very wet day. Great to see you all. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be asked by the Dublin Festival of History to convene the panel. It's hard to believe that it's now in its 11th year and we've been writing and talking about women and history during this decade of centenaries. Obviously, this is something that's gone on much longer than that. I'm reflecting on the fact that in the 1970s, when I wanted to research Irish women, I was told I couldn't because they hadn't done anything. And Margaret McCurtain, when she first wanted to put on a course on women in Irish history in UCD, had to really battle the powers that be. So from those very tentative beginnings, we have blossomed considerably, and that's what we're going to reflect over the next hour. It hasn't all been straight sailing, and there are still times, I think, when we need to be looking out for pitfalls and icebergs. We only have to think of times like the Waking the Feminists, for example, in 2016, to know that if women don't fight and argue, they are going to be left with a real pittance in terms of what a programme and an agenda can be. But women have really, I think, galvanised themselves since then. There might be backlashes, but women, I think we've come to the stage now where it is right to talk about the possibility of a women's museum because we now know what that could entail. So I don't want to preempt any of the discussion, but I'm going to just give a biographical account of our three wonderful speakers. I'll give them now so it doesn't interfere with the discussion, and then in order it'll be Liz, Mary and Sinead speaking. So historian and author Liz Gillis is from the Liberties. She's the author of 6 books about the Irish Revolution, including The Fall of Dublin, Women of the Irish Revolution, The Hales Brothers and the Irish Revolution, The Burning of the Custom House, and she co-authored with Mary McAuliffe, We Were There, the 77 Women of the Easter Rising. She's worked as a researcher on numerous publications, television and radio documentaries, and as historical consultant for the new Custom House Visitor Centre, and as a researcher for RTE Radio's The History Show. She's now historian in residence for South Dublin County Council and lectures at Champion College Dublin. And in 2018, Liz was a very worthy recipient of the Lord Mayor's Award for her contribution to history. Dr. Mary McAuliffe is a historian and director of gender studies at UCD. She has a PhD from Trinity College. Her latest publication is Margaret Skinner, a biography, and her other publications include a co-edited work, Legacies of the Magdalen Laundries, Commemoration, Gender and the Post-Colonial Carceral State. She's also co-editor of Sexual Politics in Modern Ireland. and her co-authored with Harriet Wheelock book on Kathleen Lynn, The Diaries of Kathleen Lynn, Revealing History Through Personal Writing, will be out from UCD Press this November and will be a great resource for people interested in women's history. She's currently completing her book Gendered and Sexual Violence in the Irish War of Independence and Civil War, which is forthcoming next year. Mary's a past president of the Women's History Association of Ireland and a member of the Humanities Institute, UCD, and the Women's Museum Advocacy Group. And Dr. Sinead McCoole is a member of the Irish Government's Expert Advisory Group on the Decade of Centenaries. Manor 1916 to 2016 was the National Centenary Touring Exhibition on women in 1916, created on behalf of the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. For the 1918 centenary commemoration, introducing with the introduction of voting rights for women, Sinead devised a pop-up women's museum, 100 Years of Women in Politics and Public Life. In 2021, she began curating the Manor 100 website, and some of that you'll see at the film at the end of this discussion. She also produced and presented the podcast series Manor 100, which has been listened to in 43 countries. Sinead's the author of many books, including Guns and Chiffon, Women Revolutionaries in Kilmainham Jail, No Ordinary Women, Irish Female Activists in the Revolutionary Years, and Easter Widows, the untold story of the wives of the executed leaders, as well as her biography of Hazel, Lady Lavery. Sinead's a board member of the International Association of Women's Museums and a committee member of the Association of Irish Professional Historians. So, fantastic panel, a wealth of experience, and coming from many different areas. I think we'll have a very rich discussion now, and I invite Liz to start.
I suppose my journey into looking at the women began in Kilmainham Jail, and we used to promote Sinead's book because you had written those two and you were a former guide in Kilmainham Jail. But the story of the women being told in Kilmainham, it was very small. It was Grace Gifford, really. That was the woman's story of Kilmainham. But when I started writing for Mercier Press, they asked me to do a photograph book on the women. No, they didn't actually. They asked me to do a photograph book on the Irish Revolution in Dublin. And got amazing photographs, but I started to discover all these photographs of various women, the big names and a few less well-known women. And the way I'd planned the book was that there was going to be a chapter on the women. But when the publisher looked at the book, they came back to me and said, you can't have a chapter on women in the book. There's not enough space, and just put them where you can. And that really sort of surprised me, because Mary Fionn is a woman, and the editor was a woman, and I'm told I can't put women, a chapter dedicated to women in the book. So my very good friend, Micheál O'Divlin, who passed away last year, I had a phone call with him, and I got off the phone, and I was, and he's like, what's wrong with you? So I, went off saying, do you won't let me put the women in the book, and I want to put the women in the book. And he just went, well, why don't you do a photograph book on the women? And it just stopped me dead in my tracks. And I went, okay. So got back onto Mercer and I said, I want to do a photo book on the women. And they went, okay, do it. If you can get the photographs, do it. And that's how my journey into looking at the women began, because I had just incorporated the women into the story of the history of Kilmainham Jail and the Civil War and so on. And put out a call to people, because I didn't just want it to be a book about the big names. I wanted to get as many women as possible that I could from around the country. So put out, calls in the newspaper, and the response was amazing. And the book that I produced was a result of those people getting in touch. But this was in 2013, 2012, 2013, so the pension files hadn't been released at that time. So a lot of the information was the personal stories, the family stories, and I'm sure you've probably done it yourself, going, oh, it's a family story, I don't know how much truth is in there. But then, thanks to Military Archives, and they cannot be praised enough for the work that they have done in releasing those stories of the women with the pension files. When the pension files were released, they actually verified the family stories. And it started to grow. I did a women's tour in Kilmainham Jail, based, and I will admit it, based on your work, Margaret, and your work, Sinead, because you had done that groundbreaking research when those records weren't freely available to people, that you were going to the archives, getting access to those files, and you were interviewing the relatives of those people. So it was a great basis for me to start on. But when word got out, the interest from people and the interest from men, not just women, in wanting to know these stories was huge. Got a great opportunity then to work with Mary on the Richmond Barracks, the quilt project, the 77 Women project, which was really funny because it started out as a booklet that myself and Mary were to write about these 77 women that had been imprisoned, held in Kilmainham Jail and held in Richmond Barracks the night before. And we were thinking, yeah, okay, we can do that. But this is when the pension files, the women's pension files, had just been released. And all of a sudden it went from maybe a 20-page booklet to an actual book. And there was only maybe 10 women we couldn't get information on.
I think there was only about 5 in the end.
There you go. So again, thanks to Military Archives, we were able to do that work. But what was brilliant about that project was the connection between history and creativity. Because so many people are interested in history, but not necessarily in reading books or, it's more than dates. They really want to know the people. And with this project, 77 women, some who had relatives, their relatives had been involved in 1916, they were part of that 77 women's group. And they researched the women and made a quilt, which was on display. It might still be on display in Richmond Barracks, which you can go and see. But what I found was that there was this massive interest, this build-up. 2014, because Mary, you had been organising, or were organising, the plaque in Wynn's Hotel. That was a huge event for the formation, the centenary of the formation of Cumann na Món in Wynn's Hotel. So you have that interest building from 2013. You have the Rosie Hackett Bridge campaign. You have the centenary of Cumann na Món. Then you have the Easter Rising. But then it was like the interest just stopped. Now, not from the public, because the people did want to know, but from the higher ups. It's like, we've touched on the women, we've covered them, now just put them away, don't talk about them anymore. And we had this conversation ourselves, like that we need to be resilient. We need to keep women in the forefront, their story, because they were, not that they were written our history, they were certainly put in the shadows of history, because local historians all around the country always included women in their stories. Thank God we had Cumann na Món in 2018. Because you then have this drive to tell the story, because there was the big campaign to commemorate the centenary of the anti-conscription campaign, that nationwide event. But amongst all that, you had this amazing event that happened on the 9th of June 1918, where the women of Ireland stood up to the British government and said, you're not going to conscript any Irishman into your army, and if you do, well then, we're not going to take their place in the workforce. 2/3 of the women of Ireland signed that pledge. On a day like today, the newspaper reports, they talk about the weather being atrocious. 40,000 women signed the pledge in City Hall alone. There were villages that probably hadn't got 200 people in them, yet 300 women from those villages signed this pledge. But it was a moment of political awakening as well for so many women, because 1918 was the year that women over the age of 30 were granted the right to vote whenever the next general election would happen. But there were so many women that signed the pledge that were not going to vote in that election. And the Kilkenny Archaeological Society, go on to their website, because we don't have, whereas we have the examples of signatures for the national campaign, that national pledge that was taken, you don't have that same resource with the women. They were meant to compile all the lists together and send them up to Dublin so you'd have that record of those women that took that pledge. But in Kilkenny Archaeological Society, they have a ledger. And the front of it, you have 1,000 names. And these are 1,000 women from Kilkenny, of all ages, of all political persuasions, who signed that pledge. The only reason the letter survived is because it was later used as a receipt book for a dairy. So in the front half, you have all of these names, and then scroll through, and then you've got receipts for butter and cheese and so on. But who owned that dairy was the Stallard family, and Josie Stallard was the intelligence aide for Cattle Brewer. She went on to become the first dispensary doctor in Rathcoole. She was married to Joe Clark, who was the first wounded man in the GPO, one of the first to be wounded in the GPO in 1916. So what I learned from 2016 was it is very easy to put the women back in the shadows. We cannot do that. We have to be resilient. We have to keep the women at the forefront. But thanks to archives like the military archives, national archives, the census records, the compensation claims, 1916 Property Loss Committee, those claims are amazing because you are getting the stories, not just of those who participated, but the civilian experience as well, which is just as important as those who are activists or combatants. Unfortunately, the Decade of Centenary is coming to an end, but our journey in researching these women, it is only beginning because their story did not end in 1923 or 1924. They may have been excluded from big politics, but as we discovered, myself and Mary writing the 77 Women's book, these women went on to do amazing things in their communities, to be that anchor in their communities, to try to build a brighter future. They may not have been able to achieve it because of the way the government treated women, but it certainly inspired the next generation and the next generation to build on what they had started way back in 1914 and through those years. That's me.
Thanks, Liz.
I really had to take a picture.
The excitement and the enthusiasm and the research will all go out. March in there, yeah. Okay,
Well, follow
take
that.
it up there, Mary.
Yes, follow that. Well, Liz has mentioned quite a lot that we were involved in together, and I was on the Rosie Hackett Bridge campaign and the 77 Women quilt and the booklet. And I remember when it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and we said, I think this is a book. And then we agreed. And Dublin City Council made it their book of 2016, which was great. And they and Four Courts Press brought it out. And other things like that were really important. But when I look back on, I suppose, my decade of centenaries, the markers for me are moments when I think this is really, really important. And I've done an awful lot of research on gendered and sexual violence against women in the War of Independence and Civil War. And the moment that started for me in a big way, I think was that 2014 commemoration of the foundation of Cumann na mBan. And we had an event in Wynn's Hotel where we were unveiling the plaque. At the time, I was president of the Women's History Association, so I was part organising that, and I had also organised the day before with Glasnevin Museum, where our president, Michael D. Higgins, gave a great speech about the women of Cumann na mBan, and the Guard of Honour from the Defence Forces was all women on that occasion in Glasnevin. So that was an extraordinary, and I got to stand at the grave of Elizabeth O'Farrell, where they they put a wreath on her grave and Julia Grinnan's grave. But the next day we unveiled the plaque. The Irish Volunteer plaque had been there for many, many decades, but there was no plaque to Cumann na mBan. So we approached Wynn's Hotel, asked them would they fund and put up the plaque, and they did, and it now is on the wall beside the Irish Volunteer plaque. And I had asked the theatre company to do something that evening as part of the event. Not recreate the first meeting of Cumann na mBan in Wynn's Hotel, but do something that they can only do. And working with creative people over this decade has been extraordinary, because they see history and they see the way you interpret that period in a very different way than historians do. And often it inspires and triggers thoughts and ideas that actually help your own work when you go back to it. So they had women in period dress going around, And as we were talking in the room downstairs, the room that had been used as the, supposedly, as where Cumann na Món had met, they would come downstairs and they were moving among the crowd and they were saying, will you come up to the meeting? We need more people at the meeting, and things like this. And one of them came up to me as I went upstairs and she pressed something into my hand and she said, would you be willing to sacrifice this for the fight for Ireland? And when I looked at it, it was a piece, I presume, of animal skull. And basically the story was of the young girl who was shot as the rebels retreated from the GPO to Moore Street. They shot through a door and they killed a young 12-year-old girl, Bridget, I forget her surname. Can you remember her surname? No. Bridget was her name anyway. She was about 12. Accidentally, she was shot through the head. So this was supposedly a piece of her skull. And I remember at that moment the visceral feeling of thinking, this is about blood. This is about death, violence, and war. And at that moment, I became very, very interested. Well, I had obviously noticed it, but it became almost obsessively interested in violence. And that led then into looking at the gendered and sexual violence against women. And that continued on, and now I'm writing the book. So that's been a long process of almost 10 years of research. And what I discovered, because I was quite anxious going around the country giving talks, as we all did during this decade, in many ways I'm kind of glad it's ended. It's coming to an end because I get to stay at home a bit more. But I thought, talking about this is very personal. This can be very traumatic. But what I found was the reception from people was absolutely, wanting to hear this material. And after every talk, at least 2, if not more, people would come up and say, my grandmother, my aunt, my great-aunt told those stories about what happened to them during that period, from the Black and Tans, or indeed from Republicans attacking women for company keeping and forcibly shaving their hair. And there was always stories, and there were more and more stories. And as the pension files came out, there were more and more evidence about this. So building on that, there's a huge amount of evidence out there. And this is really disabusing the idea that had really been prevalent in most of the histories of the War of Independence, particularly, and more or less the Civil War. This has been a clean war with just a few drunken Black and Tans who had committed some attacks against women. But, it wasn't really a war in which there was much violence against women that was gendered, that was targeted. And actually, when you look at it, the majority of the forcible hair cropping was done by Republicans. It was about controlling women in their own communities. It was about preventing them from company keeping with soldiers, or with the RIC, was part of the RIC boycott. There were all sorts of reasons why it was happening. And this is really changing how I look at women's experiences in the War of Independence and the Civil War, and indeed how women's contributions to that period were done under extreme pressures and threats of violence, including targeted violences. And so as I went through the Decade of Centenaries, those more hidden histories became clearer to me and to many others. But one of them in particular that I've been working on, as well as that gendered and sexual violence, is also the relationships between women, particularly the leadership groups. So women who were involved in relationships with each other, who were also revolutionary leaders. And as Margaret said, myself and Harriet Wheelock have a book on the Kathleen Lynn diaries coming out next month. I think on the 11th of November, we will be again on a stage talking about that book. But fundamental to the book on Kathleen Lynn is her relationship with Madeleine French Mullen. They lived together for nearly 30 years. They set up St. Ultan's Hospital together. Madeleine was secretary of the hospital and the chief fundraiser. They were in politics together. They'd both joined the Friends of Soviet Russia. They are both involved in all sorts of different campaigns against the anti-women legislation in the 1920s and 30s. The poignancy when you read the diaries when Madeleine dies in May 1944 and Kathleen comes back to the house and writes in her diary, oh, what a barren wilderness it is without MFFM, as she always called her there. And so those stories, and there's about 10 or 12 identifiable couples and within that leadership cohort that I'm writing up about. So those marginal stories have become very much important and central to my own research and will be going forward. And I think my experience, and all of our experience of the Decade of Centenaries, has been a flowering of history, of interest in history, but more particularly an interest in women and women's history and women's contributions and women's stories. And you could nearly just have a museum of the revolutionary women, although I wouldn't be campaigning for that. It has to be much broader than that. Because, you know, with Minoa 100, you get loads of visitors on the website. I've gone on it myself. The interest is out there, and it's not stopping now because we've come to the end, or are coming to the end of the Decade of Centenaries. It is only beginning. So the 1926 census will be released in 2.5 years, say, at this stage. It'll be so interesting to see where those women are in 1926 and what they are doing. Or are they even here? Because so many of the revolutionary women leave Ireland because they're anti-treaty. Ireland is a cold country for them. The Irish Free State is not somewhere where they feel particularly welcome. Those afterlives histories are going to be really, really important and really interesting to look at going forward. So, as Liz said, we're only just beginning. So we'll come back next year to tell you where we're at then.
I think that's what's called complicating the narrative, isn't it? It has gone out into so many different directions from where we started a decade ago. Sinead, look forward to hearing your reflections now.
Oh, thanks. Well, I've been very privileged and honoured. I suppose I'd always use those words to find yourself in a place where you end up doing something that you feel so passionately about. And I was just reflecting there when you were talking about sort of the journey and the journey that you went on. You know, I remember in UCD as a student listening to you talk about your experiences with women's history. You gave a talk based on the small booklet that you did for Attic. I lent that to a student with my lovely notes from the, you know, on the night in question, and of course never got it back, I tell you. So I'm still looking online to see if I can find that little booklet, but I want the one with my notes on it. But I think what it is we have been on a journey, and I think when you think about the people you're looking at here, you're looking at 50 years of research and investigation. I know it sounds like it's a long time, but so Margaret would have met with, you know, Leslie Bandabara. I would have been fortunate enough to have met, you know, people who were imprisoned. You know, Tessie O'Connell comes to mind, Nora Brosnan, who was in America, and that was in the 90s. And then Liz comes along, and, you know, she's in the jail, and she's meeting the next generation as Mary's gone out and met the people, you know, during the Decade of Centenaries. So we went from a history training, which was very much about oral history is a flawed source. I did the Women's Documents course in 1991 with Margaret. There were 10 of us. All of that group of people went on to contribute in some way to women's history. It was the first time in my life that I had that moment where I felt that I was elevated to seeing something differently. And Margaret talked about at the time of the Abelard and Eloise, their correspondence, medieval, you know, period, and where we were finding it was always receipt books. It was always in the hidden piece. And for somebody like me who'd been in university and I had been listening to the, you know, doing my academic work, as it were, but feeling that I hadn't really found myself, my love, my passion for history, and I also did history of art. So I've been absolutely in a wonderful position because I've worked in a curatorial capacity as well as a historian, so outside the academy. And one of the things that came about in 2012 was, because I had worked in a local authority, the way in which the expert advisory group was structured in a particular way was geographical. And I had been in Mayo, in the sort of the northwest of the country. I had worked on women, but it was more that I was there in a sort of geographical sort of sense to represent a sort of circular sort of piece in the country. And then Eamon Phoenix, who sadly passed away during the Decade of Centenaries, was also, and I'd like to remember him here today, he brought in, you know, the northern aspect. And so during the period of time, you can think politically, we were thinking about the north being there. And one of the things I'd hope we'd touch on here is, even with the talk about the Women's Museum, it's about this shared island piece. So all of a sudden, you know, even though we've had this period where we're now in a period where, you know, it's post-partition, we're now looking differently. We're looking differently north and south. We're looking differently in terms of, even years ago it was in the connection with the States and all those women who went there. Now we've sort of looked, and we've had interest in our history from, particularly in relation to the Decade of Centenaries, from Europe. People who are learning English and who are looking for trusted sources on the webs are finding their way to the work that we've been doing, not only on the McAuliffe 100 platform, but also on all of the different material, you know, the material that people have been producing, Mary and Liz, and, you know, all the different mediums. So there's been podcasts, there's been television documentaries. And as Mary has said, the books are sort of now becoming the sort of the lowest rung on the ladder, where, you know, younger people, we're struggling to get them to read. They're reading and thinking differently. But it's also that we're moving to look at how do you absorb your history. Emotionally is the one, I think, Liz, that you spoke of so eloquently there. And that's what it is. We've touched the people. So doing a program, there's a quote from Winston Churchill, which I like to use, particularly around this Decade of Centenaries. I used it before in a pre-speech I was doing some time ago, and that is, Winston Churchill said, and I'm going to be paraphrasing now, I'm going to get it right, is it the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end? So when the Decade of Centenary ends, it's the end of the period where we look at it in detail. Now, I've been looking at 1921 to 23. Can you imagine how intimidating that was? Because you're looking at a very, very small space in time, and you're trying to amplify it and make it so that people will stay interested, because it's the same subject over a period of time, like to reduce it down. So how you get the message is important. And we remember that someone comes through the door through the podcast, someone comes through the door through a television documentary, somebody sees the quilt or works on the quilt. And so history has now become, it's more of a public ownership piece more than ever. But then the academic side, the teaching of history in schools, the teaching of people taking up humanities in university, the closing of history departments. There's a lot going on in the world about history, because in some ways you'll argue that we're in a post-truth period where does it really matter what gets in the way of a real story? And going around the country, I remember one particular art exhibition from children, and it was about Countess Markovic, and all it was dogs. Bigger dogs, smaller dogs. Every single picture had a dog. And so every single child in the classroom was taken with the story of Poppet. And Poppet actually appeared in the Illustrated London News in 1917 when the Countess put him on a stool, and she made a will to make sure he was looked after in the 1916 Rising. So I was loving the idea of the dog in the pictures, but really wanting to be in the classroom to know exactly how he came into the story and how the children got caught up in that. And the greatest moment was the piece of the when people came back and fed back what they loved best. It was the proclamation being brought by the army to the schools, and the children, and that whole generation of children who became so invested in Irish history. We still need to capitalize on them, and I think we have in some ways. But I just wanted to say that, just to finish out my piece in terms of it, is Mary was at the meeting. I don't think you were, Liz, you were there, but definitely Mary was there, and it is in Chester Beatty, and it was a gathering after the Waking the Feminists, and they wanted to get all the women into the room, and they wanted a discussion around where next, and that was one of the sort of the early kernels of this Women's Museum idea, or everything moves in circles and it's happening in different places, and where does it begin and where does it end? But what I was going to say about that was, nobody knows, I can say it now because we're at the end of the Decade of Centenaries, I got a job out of that day. And somebody had asked the question, they wanted to have a survey of the next 100 years, the complexity and detailed study of what women did next for the next 100 years. And when I was handed that as a task, and maybe that was a question you asked, Mary, and I said, how long do I have? 2 years? 3 years? A decade? So anyway, I set 2. It was in the aftermath of 1916, and that became my day job. And what that became was the Pop-Up Women's Museum, because I rewrote the Irish history canon, because where do you start? You go to the canon, you look at the history books, you say, what are they telling us about life in general? And then you insert women. And we've seen over this decade the work that you did, the Anini Naharan, the interviews that you had, the formation of Cumann Amon. And I'll just end my piece. I don't know if I was paying attention, but I did go back to look at my notes. I did modern Irish history in college. I specialised in this period. I went on to do my MA in modern Irish history, looking at the Laveries and the establishment of the Irish Free State. And I have nowhere in my notes did I know that Cumann na mBan existed until I went to work in Kilmainham jail. And even then, when a woman came to the jail in 92 or 93 and said she'd been a prisoner, I thought that the only women that had been in the jail at that time were the criminal prisoners who left in 1880. So I thought, here am I going through my academic education and to think that that's where I was at. And that's where I'm saying to you, we've come, in my life, we've come such a long way.
I find that extraordinary that, that your whole history course in UCD didn't include the biggest women's organisation in
Yeah, and I thought for a long time, Margaret, that I had actually not been paying attention. I thought that I had maybe, not been there to take the notes on that day, because we were so trained. And this is one of the things you have to remember always is I went to interview women in the 90s, and I took really bad notes because I kept thinking that they were maybe at a level of their lives where they didn't remember correctly. I remember taking notes for Ida Gorman Draper. She said she was in the Fianna. I went and wrote a note and said no women, no girls in the Fianna. You know what I mean? Under my notes. So as I was listening to these people who were telling me their truth, I was using what was my training, which is this is an oral source. I must, And so we went to Kilmainham in the same way, and you were giving a version of history. And I remember that whole thing in Kilmainham at the time, and it was the 1990s. The North was ongoing. I don't know about you, but we weren't given a tour, and I remember we had a complaint in Liveline where it was Marion Finucane at the time, that someone had been to Kilmainham jail and they hadn't heard the British mentioned. And I went back over what I said on my tour, and I'd actually done what you could describe as almost like a diplomatic tightrope walk, where I had actually a ruling administration of the day, the people in power. I mean, it's sort of, but because we were in an emotive time about that history. And so one of the things is that Cumann na mBan still existed, into beyond this period in time. There was always political considerations. And one of the freedoms is, and you did mention it, is why are we talking now? There's also a freedom in the time we live in that we are able to talk and be able to be speaking freely. A lot of the silences were to protect people and protect jobs and protect their homes, and we see that in the in Cumann na mBan, in the records that have survived, the begging letters. Could you please get me a cleaning job in the houses of the Oireachtas? I served in Cumann na mBan. Could you help us get a house? Because a lot of the people who had taken this side, particularly those who opposed the state, they were treated, and they were living in dire poverty.
I'd agree with you there that it is the time we're living in now, and we are freer to talk about that. I think also you have to pay due homage to second wave feminism, and to those women who came out of second wave feminism, who asked those questions. Where are our foremothers? Where is our history, and how are we going to find it? And in the beginning, it was just about writing biographies, or the kind of add women and stir version of history. But I mean, you were writing about Cumann na mBan in the 80s, and we've been building on that ever since.
But I've just thought of something that kind of links all of this. I went on a school trip to Kilmainham in about 1966 or 67, and my geography teacher took us there, and we certainly didn't have women mentioned. I just remember it was all very heroic, and, well, poor Grace and Jo, that would have been the only woman, I think, that would have been mentioned from what I can remember. And then we came back on the bus and we stamped our feet at the Boyne and we went home again. And I didn't think about that. I knew nothing about Irish history at this time. I mean, we weren't taught it in school. And then when Maura Drum was assassinated, she had been Vice President of Sinn Féin, I went to her funeral, and my geography teacher was in the colour party. She was in Cumann na mBan, and I saw her walking. So the geography teacher, she didn't mention Cumann na mBan because she couldn't have at that time in the North in the 60s. And so when I started to research women, I couldn't find out what had happened to women in the North because that was silenced. It was second wave feminism, as you say. It was women like Sheila Rowbotham who were starting to research women in the Russian Revolution, for example, that made me think about what happened to women in Ireland, and that was the trigger, because there wasn't anything there in terms of what was happening in Ireland that's what that's about. And I think that was the difficulty of having to convince people that women had done something. So the fact that the North is now in a more peaceful situation, moving towards post-conflict, means, and we've got the pension files, so we know so much more about what the North, what happens in the North, and the difficulties that people had in the North. And I think that that's starting to make us think in an all-Ireland dimension, which we never did. Everything was so partitionist when I started, and people were very suspicious that you were interested in Republican women. And if you were interested, you had to be some kind of fellow traveller. And it just closed down a lot of discussion for a long time.
And that we talk so much now about silos, or people, where, are you permitted to talk about it if it hasn't been your experience? And there's that sort of sense that people, allow, how do you enter into your interest to be able to open up and have that archive come to light? And in the same way that Liz has talked about, going out and collecting an archive, and Mary, you've had this experience as well, is that, Kilmainham was one of the sort of the repositories for that material that we collected. And a lot of the people that I met in the 90s were looking for someone to take custody of the material, and they were very conscious of, how their family would be perceived in those contexts. So it wasn't just even the people who were asking the questions. And I remember I went to one house, and the man says, "I can't believe the government are actually coming to talk to us." And I said, "I don't understand what you're talking about." And the idea that he thought I represented, the government. And he said, "Well, don't you work in Kilmainham jail, and aren't you collecting it for the state?" And I thought, that was a really interesting moment. And instead of it being a negative for me, I just thought it was such an important job. So I was on government business collecting this material. And up until that time, when someone would say, "What would you think? Do you think this has a value?" That was the big thing. People say, "Would you have a value on this?" And I was thinking, well, I can't place a value on it because we didn't buy anything. We only took donations. And so I ended up, talking about how priceless the history was, and a little bit like you explained there about the wonderful thing about the book, those 1,000 women's names. Well, you always hope when you say something in a public forum that you'll find another book, or 3 books, or 4 books. And the one that comes to mind is the book that you found in the Hannah Sheehy Skeffington papers, which is the piece about the little piece, which is Rosamund Jacobs, and it has English notes in the back, and then has the minutes of the which is the women. And so just in an aside, it was Margaret's research, it was Margaret's piece in the History of Ireland, and when we were talking about the creativity piece, and I was on holidays at one stage, and I entered a competition, I didn't win it, to write a play, and I thought it was an ideal setting for a play, because it's the leading women of the time had to have a meeting in the ladies' toilet at the Mansion House, and it's really critical because it's the moment where they're trying to select nominees to be put forward for the positions to get into Parliament, to be into government, and it has this underpinning about the importance of people working together and the unification. And I think the Decade of Centenaries allowed for meeting people and a conversation constantly with people who were interested. And it nearly took 10 years to bring all the people into the room. People say, "Oh, somebody came up to me once and said, I've been trying to get in touch with you for 8 years now." And I said, "Oh, how have you been trying to get in touch with me?" And she said, "Oh, no, I just kept putting it on the long finger." And that was it. It took 8 years, yeah.
Well, and as somebody who, being from Kerry, where the Civil War was particularly vicious, earlier this year, myself and 2 others organised the Kerry Civil War Conference, at which Liz and Margaret both spoke. But we were very anxious. Now, we got funding from the department and from Kerry County Council under the Decade of Centenaries. And we'd been planning this for about a year, and we were very anxious because the Civil War, which we can now talk about to a greater degree, there's still silences around it, but particularly in Kerry, the Civil War is a very, very fraught space. And if you talk about it at all, it's about Ballyseedy, and it's about the atrocities and where women fit into that. Well, it doesn't happen to even come into people's consciousness in many ways. But the Kerry women, there was a whole crowd of Kerry women in Kilmainham jail, the Kerry girls, because they were vehemently anti-treaty. And so when we decided to hold the conference, we were determined that we would have all the stories of the Civil War. And we were absolutely blown away. Well, that's an unfortunate statement.
We weren't taking that anyway.
Yes, we were absolutely surprised when we had the conference. It was packed out every day. People could not get enough of the stories. We reshowed the Pat Butler's Ballyseedy, a very emotive documentary. The talks were filmed and they're online and they're still being watched over and over and over again. KerryCivilWarConference.ie if you want to go on and see them. And it was more about the Civil War. Margaret talked about the women in Belfast. So I think we have to take into account the divisions and the silences, the partitionist silences, but also the Civil War silences when it comes to talking about women. Because for the vast majority of Republican women, Cumann na mBan women, they were anti-treaty. And they get blamed in large part as, you know, Amazons, diehards, bloodthirsty, awful women who created by their actions the Civil War. And so in the Irish Free State, they get marginalised, they get sidelined. They don't get the military pension. They're not allowed to apply for it in the first place when it begins. Margaret Skinnider, whom I wrote about, went for her pension. She fought with the Irish Citizen Army and was wounded 3 times in 1916. She was denied a pension when she went for it first because she was an anti-treatyite. They pretended it was because she was a woman, but it was because she was an anti-treatyite.
Well, the legislation in the initial stages.
But if you go into the detail, they're saying we're not giving her anything, so make sure.
And Breed Lyons Thornton got her
And Breed Lyons Thornton gets her pension.
She was well, but she was also that kind of came under the fact that she had been in the army.
They fudged it all.
No, but
they did mean it. Yeah.
I've seen papers from Bridget Lyons Thornton, and it's really interesting because when she was an army officer, she was really well connected into unpicking how they would go about putting together her application. And one of the
make sure she gets
it. Make sure she get it. But one of the most interesting ones, and I think it's just interesting for continuity in terms of one of the pensions, one of the best pensions I ever read was Brendan O'Carroll's mother, Maureen, who was a Labour TD. It was her mother's application. She managed to put together a sort of a rainbow of all the different sides. Nobody could see where her politics were coming from. And she even got an archbishop to write that her children were the children of their uncle was in Maynooth University, that showed their calibre, and that if they weren't educated to their level, that it would be a loss for Ireland. And I just think that particular one is just a masterclass in knowing what's behind the scenes.
But also when you look at the pension applications themselves, the women have to jump through hoops to prove that they actually gave something of value in their contribution as members of Cumann na mBan or whatever organisation they were in to the fight for Irish independence. And they get turned down, very easily by saying nothing of value here, really. Or
they can only get grade D or grade E anyway, no matter what they've done. Yeah.
And there's a whole section, and you probably came across this, Liz.
Well, you have James Connolly's widow, where she's having to send begging letters. And our daughter Nora is sending in begging letters. And I've said this before many times, fair play to Richard Mulcahy. And he writes to the department saying, surely the widow of James Connolly does not have to prove her husband gave her life for Ireland, give her the money. But you see that so many times, and it's heartbreaking. And it's like, you had to... What the women are saying, what did you do, or replying to the questions, what did you do? Meetings. Well, how many nights did you have the meetings on? How many times did you meet with that intelligence officer? They are jumping through hoops to get a paltry amount. It's hard reading, makes you very bloody angry. And what's even worse are the mothers' pensions of the dependents if their child died in the conflict. And they are absolutely heartbreaking because in some cases it was the eldest son that was killed, and they were the breadwinner. But what has been great about those pension files, it really brings the human aspect to it. It's not just a two-dimensional person that you're looking at. But one thing I would like to say about this decade is the contribution from the people. the local history societies, the local groups. Oh my God, like the people have taken the history back and they have expressed it in a way that is so different. Like what Mary was saying with the artists, like they're seeing it through a different lens, but it is every community has been pretty much recognised in this decade, thanks to those archives being made available. And I think what was great about 2015, 2016, when they had in Stephen's Green, you know, the food of the year, where you get your hair done in the style of what it was in 2016. So it's become so accessible, the history, and it appeals to everyone. But coming together, all of those artists, you know, singers, songwriters, playwrights, it has just been a rich time for us to discover this history and share this history, but from the ground up, because, you know, the historians don't know everything. There's an awful lot of knowledge from the local level, as I discovered last night in Waterford. You know, the local communities know their history and are now proud to remember the people from their community that were involved in this period and beyond. And the most important thing is that the work being done with the kids, with the school children. What they come up with is amazing, and you know, they're the toughest audience as well. I did a seminar with 1,500 kids online, and you think I didn't know anything, because they were asking me about, I was talking about coming them on and the fee in it and stuff, and next of all the questions, how much was the fee in a uniform? Did they have to save? And I'm like, I promise I'm in the story and I'll get back to you. And every question they asked me, it was like, I don't know. It's like, felt totally insecure. But that is what has been brilliant about this, because if the kids aren't interested, then it's all
well, they're the next generation of historians. Keep it going.
Well, I think that's a good time to open it up to the audience to ask questions, and ask questions that tax our panel here.
That's the worst.
If there's anyone, if you wait for the microphones, yep.
I don't think it's on.
Is it on? Can't. Oh, that's better.
It's working. Thanks very much for giving a great talk. And as someone who, I did my junior cert in 2016, there was loads of events on, and it's definitely one of the reasons that I went to college and did history. So thanks very much for that and everything you did over the last 10 years. I have a question for Mary in particular about kind of violence against women in this time. Obviously, Ireland was a very radicalised and traumatised place after all this violence. And I just wanted to ask whether, even in a non-revolutionary setting or context, did you really see, probably in your book we'll find out, does that kind of violence against women and sexual assault, is that an epidemic still in Irish society after the Civil War?
Well, I think even today it's an epidemic in society, not just here but globally. You know, we heard the bad news yesterday of another killing of a woman, and there have just been some horrific incidences over the last few years, and they're the ones that stand out. If you read the newspapers any day, there's trial after trial. So, and that's a module I actually teach in UCD is about violence and gender, and we talk about that even in peacetime, there is a level of sexual violence in society that we almost don't even think about much because it's so normalised. But in war, there are particular types of violences that can be different. So in the Irish War of Independence, it was the forcible hair cropping that was the targeted gender. There was sexual abuse and rape that did happen by armed militias or armed military groups. But the targeted shaving of women's hair, and I'm not saying they shaved it, it was violent. And it's interesting, you know, because all sorts of different questions come up when you're researching that. And I've been doing this research now for a decade. And it was only recently that I thought, somebody asked me when it happened, I said it happened mainly at night. And the women were dragged out of their beds, the house was invaded, armed and masked men. This is usually the report you get. The young women are dragged out of their beds in their night attire. And the person said, like you, Liz, they go, and what night attire did people wear then? I'm like, I had imagined night dresses, I suppose. But then I did a big interview with a dress historian, so now I have a whole article I'm writing on night attire and what happened and what they were wearing and how more vulnerable they are, because in many cases, and a lot of these attacks were among young working class or rural poor women, they aren't wearing a night attire. They're wearing probably old clothing or night dresses made from flour bags, apparently was a big thing. And they aren't wearing underwear for the most part. So that to me gives an even more, a heightened vulnerability for these women when you think they're isolated among a gang of armed men. And that totally changes how I'm thinking, or has changed, how I'm thinking about how these attacks were carried out and what happened, as well as the hair cropping. So, this research I'm doing has aspects of it that continue on into peacetime because, of course, sexual violence continues, gendered violence continues. But there is a very specific type of violence that happens because of war situations as well. When the book comes out, that'll be great, but I imagine that another generation will build on that and build on that. This is only the beginning of this type of research as well.
Is another hand up? I can't see.
A relative of mine, Nellie Lambert, was held in Kilmainham, and I believe her autograph book is still there. I know that's quite a personal thing that she would have had for herself. Are there many resources like that from other women, or are they mainly more like official documents?
Sorry, can I come in on this? Because I remember that Nellie Lambert book coming into Kilmainham Jail. So I took it into Kilmainham Jail. And thanks to that autograph book, we were able to work out the cell numbers in the East Wing. It was amazing. Sinead, you had found material in military archives to Drawden of the East Wing that had some of the inscriptions above the cell doors and stuff. Yeah. And then Nellie Lambert's son came in with his mate Paddy, and they were like something out of glasses over wine, two like big kids. And I remember he came in with the autograph book, and he says, I need a home for this. And himself and Micheál O'Divlin were there, and I said, look, had a look, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. So I said, look, go on tour, and we'll have a look. He said, because all I want to do is I want to see where my mum's cell was. And I was like, we'll try and find it. Look, we have a rough idea, but go on tour. So we're looking through it, and next of all, Nellie Lambert, she wrote inch fort, cell, whatever. And we ran down to the East Wing, and inscribed above the cell was inch fort. So literally when he came off the tour, me and Micheál, like two big kids standing there, grinning from ear to ear. And we're like, we found it. And we brought him down, and I remember he just walked into our cell, and he just said, I'm home. Well, I was gone. But then from that, and that was the great thing, and that is the great thing about places like Kilmainham, like the Kilmurray Museum down in Cork, Cork Public Museum. It is a space for people to go and say, look, I want this thing to have a home because it's lying in a drawer. And because of that autograph book, because we were able to work out the cell numbers in the East Wing, because it did change between the War of Independence and the Civil War, then when we were doing research on the Custom House, I met so many relatives of the Custom House men, sorry, I'm getting a bit excited now, that with their autograph books, they wrote the cell numbers. So we were able to bring the relatives of those people into the cells. And money can't buy that. When you're standing beside a person who was in the cells, their father and mother was in 100 years before, and you're seeing that reaction that they are there, you're witnessing that. That's the joy of working in history in a place like Kilmainham or those museums where you can be part of that and ensuring that material is there for future generations. So the autograph books, the letters, anything like that. If anyone has them in their attics, please give them to a local museum or something. Get them digitised just that they can be shared, because the value to the personal knowledge is huge. And it keeps those people, their memory alive as well. So yes, lots of resources, lots of autograph books. They're brilliant, and a great resource to go to Kilmainham and have lots of them.
That's a beautiful story, beautiful example. and the excitements of the primary.
No,
Oh,
Yeah,
you see it, yeah.
And the
Just stand up. Oh, sorry. Hi. Just to reinforce that idea about primary forces, our sources. I've been going to these conferences since the decade started. I was at the 1916 one, and I turn up whenever I can. It's really important that people remember that there isn't a financial value on those things in the cupboard. There's a huge national and emotional context there. It's really important that people who have items donate them, and that families among themselves agree to donate them as groups. Not that you get one letter belong to an individual, but the papers are kept together. And because those papers may not look much to a family who are familiar with them, but they link in with other families. And when you put them all together, you get a lovely understanding of those people. Separately, although we're talking a lot about women, those women lived with men. They lived in families. Sometimes what happens is the women are interested in the women's papers, and the men take the stuff relating to the army, and the people take other items. And that's again where you must keep papers together. You must donate them. Don't put a financial value on them, because there isn't a financial value on them. The people who created them didn't put a financial value on them. Or if there is a financial value, let's make sure that the papers go to the right places, that they go to public archives where they can be seen by everybody, that they don't go into private collections and disappear. I think that's really important. Separately, again, the significance of the material should be judged by people more than just the family. Because very often, like I've looked at boxes of material, and suddenly out comes a reference to my grandfather going to becoming a porter in a hotel, and I thought that had no significance because I was interested in the women's history. So you must get somebody with a professional background, with an objective background, to look at the material and to gather it together and to build on your work for the last 50 years.
I don't think you'd find a person on this stage that disagree with one word. Yeah.
We planted her.
Yeah.
No, we
I know. Also, I agree. I mean, all of us would use not just women's material, but men's material in finding the women as well, but reading. And, you know, you look at it in the round and what's going on. And while we would centre in on the women's experience, obviously it's not happening in isolation. You have to understand the broader picture of what's going on as well.
Margaret?
And I've been very privileged to be given some photographs and material. And we all feel it a privilege when people share their stories or their material with you. Because it's a real privilege and responsibility to use it with their permission, to integrate it into your own work. And it's just to have that. It's fantastic.
I think that we're going to have to, if anyone...
I think there's one more question.
There was one there.
It's okay.
It's just to say that, just in the...
I was just going to ask if the panel wanted to just, any sort of comments to wind up before, then we're going to see a short film of Minorna 100 at the end. But if anyone just has any things you didn't get to say that you want to say in a few sentences.
No, I just wanted to add that in terms of the autograph book, because I know that most of you here would probably know that, there were no official lists of women imprisoned during the Civil War. And, you know, what has come out of, I think, out of this discussion is that everybody's working and building like a blocks on their own, on each of the other's work. And so the lists are incomplete, but if you get the more and more autograph books, you can actually add women. So sometimes people will say, I didn't find my grandmother in that particular list in a book. And I often think about, you know, your book now is updated, The Unmanageable Revolutionaries, and you've added to it. So in the latest edition of your book, it's so rich with more material that you've found over this period in time. And so I obviously have the original book on my shelf. And then, you know, to know that you keep reading and you keep adding to it, I think is really important. And also, because of this being based in a library, it's really important that people, go to the library and request the books, because some things get deaccessioned, and then all of a sudden a book becomes rare and it disappears. Particularly a lot of the early women's books, even the material that was put together, like say, it was a false program. If you remember, there was a series from the 70s. The first of it was called Missing Pieces, and I remember that Dean's Grange Library had those books, but they were paperback, and that, and the thing with it is, but that's what I'm saying to you, that those ones are rare. So when you talk about the value, and just to put on for that, to just end up, and it is yes, we've gone through a period where there were sales during the Decade of Centenaries, particularly where a lot of things sold for money, but a lot of the material was broken up. And I was thinking about this particular event, and I was thinking, if you had asked me what I was sad about, and I'll just end with this one, is that Kathleen Clark kept her collection intact. She hid it in a particular place so that they would have that record of her life, of Tom's life, right down to the material that he'd smuggled out of prison. You know, when Mary says about the idea of the men's history, it's all intertwined. And then it was sold in lots. Now, the National Library got a tranche of the material. They got the love letters and then somewhere else. But a lot of private collectors took those key pieces, the pieces that add in the extra story, the British military aspect of Tom Clark's life and all of that. So the digitized piece, when people come together and when you're called from a library to come in with your family, we want to everybody, and we're talking obviously to convert it. I always feel like that when you're in a situation like this, but this is being televised, and who knows where it'll land, is that if somebody comes home to Ireland with one autograph book and digitizes it, we will be able to have that and keep it.
Absolutely. And I would absolutely echo that. You know, there's still more material out there. I mean, we've access to huge amounts of material, but there is more out there. And particularly the Civil War material would be very, very good to have. But I suppose I could end in saying it's been a real privilege to this Decade of Centenaries, as it was exhausting and invigorating and fantastic, and meeting so many people around the country who want to share their family histories and their stories, and they are sharing them and giving material to the archives and to the libraries. And local libraries particularly are building up their collections. It doesn't necessarily have to be Kilmainham or the National Archives or the National Library. UCD have a great political and Republican of the period revolutionary archive as well, which they're building on. And they are, I think, now digitising the Richard Mulcahy papers, which will have a huge amount of material on both men and women. And this will continue on going forward. So we will never stop changing and updating and reanalyzing and revisiting, and in the best sense, doing revisions of history, because history isn't static. What happened, happened. But our analysis and our interpretation and our reading of it changes all the time with new insights and new material. And that's what's the most fascinating thing about it. But mainly I want to pay tribute to all the people out there who have sustained their interest in this period and other parts of history, who have continued to contribute, who are doing the work at local level as well, and continue to do that work at local level. And I think going forward, hopefully, because of schools now are getting children to do history projects, and they're showing them how to do research using the great digitised archives online and local archives, that we will have another generation, several generations of historians who will grow up and come on and use that material and write their interpretations and analysis of histories and build on all our work going forward. And that's great, and that's great to think that will happen.
And I have to follow that now. And just to reiterate what Mary has said there, it has been such a privilege to have been able to talk. Like, I started in Kilmainham jail a week before the 90th anniversary in 2006, and I thought, I've hit it. I don't want to work anywhere else. I've done it. And I was just so happy to be talking about those men and those women. But for me, meeting the relatives of those men and women who gave so much, and not just hearing the stories of what they did in that 20-year period, but very importantly what their life was like after it, because that's what we forget. These were ordinary men and women living in an extraordinary time, and that has been the huge privilege for me, is that I've been able to get, I think we've all been able to get to know who these people were, what they were actually like as a mother, a father, an aunt, a grandparent, and so on. But those stories have come from the public. And what I would just like to see in the future, but I think our future is safe because there is that interest from the public, but especially from the younger generation, like yourself, that is now studying history. It is your job to inspire the next generation. Hopefully that we've inspired maybe you a little bit, that you are to inspire the next generation, and that thread continues, because if it doesn't, then they're all forgotten about, and we can't let that happen. But it's been brilliant and a privilege to just be a little cog in the whole journey of remembering this period of our history.
I'd just like to take Chair's privilege is also to say that I've been trying to find out more about women in Belfast in particular, but women in the north, in a way that it wasn't possible before. So I did have a letter in the Irish News calling for people, if they did have relatives, to let me know, and I have had responses, but quite often they might have been able to glean together what the grandmother or the great aunt did, but very often don't have a photo of her. And I think that so much was destroyed in the north because they were afraid of raids, etc. The frustration is really terrible, but I still hope that there might be some more out there and we could find out more, particularly photos. I would just love to see more of those women and what they did. But let's thank our great panel. And thank all of you for being here, and we'll just be able to end now with the film.
Have we go down there?
Right. Yeah.